Hey everyone, welcome back. This is video 2 for this week. And in the last video, I talked about what an argument is. We talked about premises and conclusions. And in this video, I want to talk about valid and sound arguments and what it means for an argument to be good, at least in philosophy. So when given an argument and we want to see whether or not the argument really gives good support for the conclusion, there are two questions we should always ask. Question number one is, are the premises true? Right? In the Gettier argument, he says Smith has a justified true belief. Is that true? We should ask, is it true that Smith has a justified true belief? Because if our answer is no, then the argument doesn't really support the conclusion. Because the definition might still be true. Knowledge might be justified true belief. Smith can't help us figure that out because Smith doesn't have a justified true belief. So if the premises aren't all true, if the claims made to support the argument are false, then that means the argument's not giving the support for the conclusion that it pretends to. And so that means there's a problem with the argument. So we should always ask, are the premises actually true? Are these claims made to support the conclusion actually true claims that we accept? That's an important question to ask about arguments. And another important question we should ask is, does the conclusion really follow from the premises? And what I mean by that is, if the premises were true, forgetting for a second whether or not they are, if the premises were true, would that mean that the conclusion would have to be true also? Does it follow from the premises that the conclusion is true? Do the premises entail the conclusion? Or is it possible, at least, for the premises to all be true, but the conclusion to be false anyway? Because if that's true, if the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, if it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false, then the argument doesn't really give the support for the conclusion that we want it to. Because even if all the premises are true, the conclusion might still be false. And so then it's not really giving us a good reason to believe the conclusion is true. Because the conclusion could be false even if all of the support given in the argument were true. So we always want to ask whether or not the premises are true and whether or not the premises being true really means that the conclusion would be true too. And so those are our two questions that we want to ask. And there are two separate questions, two separate issues. And for the argument to really be good, to support the conclusion the way we want it to be supported, we need the answer to be yes for both questions. And for many arguments, the answer to one question might be yes, but the other question might be no. And so it's important that we ask both questions, because a yes to just one of these questions won't be enough. So let's look at some examples. So here's an argument. I don't know anyone who's ever actually made this argument, but here's an argument just for us to look at. Step one, premise one. Richard Nixon was a polar bear. That's premise one. Premise two. All polar bears are blue. Conclusion. Therefore, Richard Nixon was blue. And there, just if you had trouble imagining premise one being true, there is Richard Nixon as a polar bear, or at least Richard Nixon's head photoshopped on a polar bear's body. Close enough. So let's ask both of our questions about this argument. Question one, are the premises true? Well, premise one says Richard Nixon was a polar bear. That's not true. You feel free to Google it if you want to fact check me, but Richard Nixon was not, in fact, a polar bear. He was a human person who was president of the United States until he resigned in disgrace after committing a bunch of crimes, which is not something any polar bear has ever done, as far as I know. So premise one is false. Now let's look at premise two. Premise two says all polar bears are blue. And again, that is false. Polar bears are in fact white, or at least their fur is white. I have no idea what a polar bear looks like under the fur, but I'm pretty positive under the fur the polar bear is not blue, whatever it is. So no, polar bears are not blue. So the premises are both false. Really, we can say no to this question as soon as we find one premise that's false. But just as an exercise, we'll ask for every premise here. So the premises are false. So the answer to our first question is no. No, all the premises are not true. Question 2. Does the conclusion follow from the premises? Now, we said that the premises are false, right? Richard Nixon was not a polar bear, and polar bears are not blue. But suppose, hypothetically, that the premises were true. If Richard Nixon was a polar bear, and if all polar bears were blue, would that mean that Richard Nixon would be blue? Yes. Yes, it does. Because if Richard Nixon was a polar bear and all polar bears were blue, he would have to be blue. If he were a polar bear and not blue, then it couldn't possibly be true that all polar bears were blue. Richard Nixon would be a counterexample. He'd be a polar bear that wasn't blue. So the only way that both premises could be true is if the conclusion were also true. So the conclusion does follow from the premises. The answer to our second question is yes. Another way to think about the conclusion following from the premises is, are the premises together sufficient for the conclusion to be true? And the answer here is yes. Premise 1 and premise 2 together are sufficient for the conclusion to be true too. So there's another use of necessary and sufficient conditions. We want our premises to be sufficient, together at least, sufficient for the conclusion to be true. And in this case, they are. Here's another example. Premise 1. Richard Nixon and Elvis Presley were once in the same room. Premise 2. Best friends are sometimes in the same room. Conclusion. Therefore, Richard Nixon and Elvis Presley were best friends. So that's an argument. Now, let's ask our two questions. Question 1. Are the premises true? Well, let's look. Premise 1 says that Richard Nixon and Elvis Presley were once in the same room. And that is true. If you weren't aware, I've added a little photographic evidence on the slide to help convince you that it is in fact true. They were once in the same room. They shook hands and everything. Now, premise 2. Best friends are sometimes in the same room. Yeah, that's true. It's maybe not, it doesn't happen maybe as often as it did before the pandemic, but it's certainly true. Sometimes in the world, throughout human history, sometimes best friends have been in the same room. So that's true. Best friends are sometimes in the same room. Not all best friends. I'm sure there are best friends who are just pen pals somewhere in the world. But in general, sometimes there are best friends in the same room. So premise 2 is true, and premise 1 is true. So the answer to our question is yes. Both premises are true. All of the premises of this argument are true. Now, let's ask our second question. Does the conclusion follow from the premises? And the answer to that is no. No, it does not. Premise 1 says that Richard Nixon and Elvis Presley were once in the same room. Premise 2 says best friends are sometimes in the same room. Does it follow from those that Richard Nixon and Elvis Presley were best friends? No. Because even if both premises were true, The fact that two people were once in the same room, and best friends are sometimes in the same room, does not mean that any two people who are in the same room must be best friends. As a matter of fact, many people are in the same room as people who aren't their best friend, probably pretty often. Again, not as often now during a a pandemic, but in general, you can be in the same room as someone who's not your best friend. That is perfectly possible. And as long as that is possible, the premises could be true without the conclusion being true. So the conclusion does not follow from the premises. The premises are not sufficient for the conclusion. They're not the conclusion, the premises being true is not a sufficient condition for the conclusion to be true in this argument. And notice that the same thing applies no matter who we're talking about. If you replaced Richard Nixon and Elvis Presley with you and your actual best friend, this argument would still the answer to the second question for this argument would still be no. Even if the premises were true and the conclusion was also true, the conclusion would still not follow from the premises. And so, even if the conclusion were true, that wouldn't necessarily mean the conclusion followed from the premises. So, let's look at another example. Premise one: all platypuses are mammals. And premise two: mammals don't lay eggs. So, conclusion: therefore, platypuses don't lay eggs. And there's a picture of a platypus. It's a super weird animal. However weird you think platypuses are, I suggest you Google it because they're weirder than that. But that's not the point of this class. So let's ask our two questions about this argument. Question one: are the premises true? Well, premise one says all platypuses are mammals. And that is in fact true. Platypuses are mammals. If something's not a mammal, then it's not a platypus. So platypuses are mammals. That's true. Premise two: mammals don't lay eggs. Is that premise true? No. Some mammals do lay eggs. Hedgehogs echidnas. That's what I'm thinking of. Echidnas lay eggs and platypuses lay eggs. Platypuses are mammals that nevertheless lay eggs. Monotremes, I think, is the name for the group. Most of them are in Australia. So, premise two is false. Premise one is true, but premise two is false. And that one premise being false means that the answer to our first question is no. When we ask, are the premises true, we only say yes if all of the premises are true. One false premise can break the whole argument. One false premise is all you need to reject the argument. So we only say yes to our first question if all of the premises are true. So when we ask, are the premises are true, we're asking, are they all true? And in this case, the answer is no. We have one true premise, but we have one false premise. And so now let's ask our second question. Does the conclusion follow from the premises? Well, let's look. Suppose, hypothetically, that all platypuses were mammals and mammals didn't lay eggs. No mammal lays eggs. Well, in that case, platypuses would not lay eggs because they would be mammals. And if they did lay eggs, then there would be mammals that laid eggs. So the premise two would be false. So if premises one and two are both true, if they were both true, then that would mean the conclusion would have to be true because all platypuses are mammals and mammals don't lay eggs. So therefore, platypuses don't lay eggs. So the conclusion does follow from the premises. If the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true. And so the answer to our second question is yes. So we have one false premise, one true premise, and the conclusion follows from the premises. But that one premise is enough to be a problem because the conclusion of this argument is in fact false. If you accepted that platypuses don't lay eggs based on this argument, you would have been making a mistake because the conclusion is in fact false. So that one false premise is enough for us to reject the argument. We should reject this argument and refuse to accept the conclusion based on the argument. So one false premise is enough. Even if all the other premises are true, one false premise is enough to ruin the argument. Now, here's another example. All cows are mammals. Premise 1. Some mammals lay eggs. Premise 2. Therefore, cows lay eggs. Premise 3. Now, let's ask our two questions about this argument. Are the premises true? Well, premise 1 says cows are mammals, and that is in fact true. Feel free to look it up. Premise 2 says some mammals lay eggs, which, as we just discussed on the last slide at the last example, is true. Platypuses are mammals that lay eggs. Echidnas are mammals that lay eggs. So some mammals lay eggs. So premise 1 is true, and premise 2 is true. So therefore, yes, all of the premises are true. The answer to our first question is yes. But now let's ask our second question. Does the conclusion follow from the premises? Well, let's look. Premise 1 says all cows are mammals, and 2 says some mammals lay eggs. It doesn't say all mammals lay eggs, it says some mammals lay eggs. So does it follow from that cows lay eggs? The answer to that is no. It does not. Because cows are mammals and some mammals lay eggs, but it does not mean, those two premises alone do not mean that cows are among the some mammals that lay eggs. And in fact, they aren't. So the premises are true and the conclusion is false, and that means the conclusion does not follow from the premises. You can compare this to arguments with a similar structure. You might say, all pets are animals. Some animals live out in the wild. Therefore, pets live out in the wild, right? In that case, that follows the same sort of structure as this argument. We'll talk about structure in a little bit. That follows the same sort of structure as this argument, but it starts with probably true premises and still has a false conclusion. So any argument that reminds you of this argument, that has the same sort of structure, should make you nervous, because this kind of argument is just flawed. The conclusion will not follow from the premises. Now, we've looked at some examples. We've asked our two questions. Now, how do we characterize arguments that get different answers to these questions? Well, the words we use in philosophy are valid and sound. These are our core concepts, our core terms for describing arguments. So an argument is valid when the conclusion follows from the premises. So an argument's valid when the answer to our second question is yes. This means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. If hypothetically the premises were true, then the conclusion would also have to be true. Another way of phrasing this is that the premises together are a sufficient condition for the conclusion. Once those premises are all true, or once you find out that those premises are all true, then the conclusion must be true. So you can conclude the conclusion is true. But an argument being valid does not mean that the premises are actually true. They might be, but they might not be. So the answer to our first question, are all the premises true, has nothing to do with whether or not the argument's valid. Whether or not the argument's valid is just a matter of our answer to that second question. Our answer to the does the conclusion follow from the premises question. If the answer to that question is yes, then the argument's valid. If our answer to that second question is no, then the argument is not valid or invalid. So valid arguments might have false premises, and they might have false conclusions too. But they cannot have true premises and a false conclusion. That means the argument is not valid. So if it's even possible for the premises to be true while the conclusion is false, then the argument is not valid. If you can come up with any hypothetical case where all the premises of the argument are true, but the conclusion of the argument is false, that means the argument is not valid. That is a counterexample to the argument. So let's apply this to one of our earlier examples. We said Richard Nixon was a polar bear. All polar bears are blue. Therefore, Richard Nixon was blue. And the conclusion follows from the premises. It is impossible for premises 1 and 2 to be true without the conclusion, 3, also being true. Right? We said the conclusion does follow from the premises. So this argument is valid. But the conclusion is still false because the premises are false. So the fact that the premises are false doesn't mean the conclusion has to be false. But if the argument's valid, then the conclusion being false means that one of the premises must be false. And in this case, both premises are false. So this argument is valid. The conclusion does follow from the premises. Yet it has false premises and a false conclusion. So the argument being valid does not tell us whether the premises and conclusion are true or false. It just tells us that if the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true. That's all validity tells us. So notice that argument had a certain structure to it. So it said Richard Nixon is a polar bear. It said all polar bears are blue. Therefore, Richard Nixon is blue. Anything with that same structure to it, that someone or something is X, all X's are Y, therefore that thing or that something is Y. Anything with that structure will also be valid. So for example, here's an argument using that exact same structure, but with a different something and a different X and a different Y. So premise 1, Lassie was a dog, which notice is grammatically similar to Richard Nixon was a polar bear. Lassie was a dog. Blank was a blank. And premise 2, all dogs are animals. Notice the grammatical similarity there between all dogs are animals with all polar bears are blue. Therefore, conclusion, Lassie was an animal. Notice Lassie was an animal. Richard Nixon was blue. Grammatically, very similar statements. And there, just so you can see, is a picture of Lassie from, I don't know, a DVD or VHS collection. Lassie was a dog in movies and TV shows in the 50s and 60s. So Lassie was a dog. All dogs are animals. Therefore, Lassie was an animal. That argument has the same structure as the Richard Nixon polar bear argument. And so it's also valid. The structure of the argument by itself guarantees that it's valid without having to worry about the details of what you plugged into that structure, whether it's Richard Nixon or Lassie or dog or polar bear or animals or blue. Anything you plug into this structure will be valid. And so the validity doesn't really care about what you plug into the structure. And so it doesn't care whether the premises or conclusion are true. If you replace Lassie here with Richard Nixon, you would still get a valid argument, but it would no longer have true premises. Richard Nixon was not, in fact, a dog. So the argument has the same structure, and so it's also valid. But in this case, the premises are true. Lassie was a dog, and all dogs are animals. And since the conclusion follows from these true premises, that means the conclusion must be true. And so this valid argument has true premises and a true conclusion. The Nixon polar bear argument is also valid, has the same structure, but false premises and a false conclusion. And so knowing that an argument is valid, maybe because you looked at the structure or through some other means, you figured out an argument is valid, that by itself doesn't tell you that the premises are true. And more importantly, it doesn't tell you whether or not the conclusion is true. It only tells you that if the premises are all true, then the conclusion must be true. If all the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. An argument being valid just means it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. That combo can't happen. You can't have true premises and a false conclusion in any hypothetical scenario. So if an argument is valid and its conclusion is false, that means at least one of the premises must be false. Right? So if you see an argument and you're positive the conclusion is false, but the argument's valid, that means one of the premises has to be false, and you should try to figure out which one it is. The job is to figure out which of the premises is false. Because if you're given an argument and you accept all of the premises of the argument, but you don't accept the conclusion, then either the argument is not valid, or you're mistaken about the conclusion and the conclusion really is true, or you're mistaken about one of the premises and one of the premises is false, and you should stop believing that false premise. So no matter what, if you're given an argument where you accept all the premises and the conclusion is false, one of those three has to be true, and you should figure out which one it is. If the argument's invalid, great, you don't have to revise any of your beliefs. But if the argument is valid and you believe the premises and don't believe the conclusion, that means you're wrong about something. Maybe you're wrong to believe one of the premises, maybe you're wrong not to believe the conclusion. But if you're given a valid argument, you believe the premises but not the conclusion, then something's wrong, and you need to figure out what it is so that you can revise it and make progress towards the truth, like we talked about in the first video. We want these arguments to be tools for us to make progress, to learn more, to discover the truth. And so the job is to figure out which premise is false, or if the conclusion really is true. So we've talked about validity. Validity doesn't guarantee that the premises of an argument are true, and it doesn't guarantee the conclusion of an argument is true. But the point of an argument is to find out what's true. So we don't just want to know whether or not the argument's valid. We also want to know whether or not the argument is sound. And an argument is sound if it is valid and all of its premises are true. So a sound argument is an argument that is valid and has all true premises. So sound arguments always have true conclusions. Always. By definition. The premises are true and the argument's valid, meaning if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So therefore, the conclusion must be true. Sound arguments must have true conclusions. If the conclusion's false, the argument's not sound. And so if you're given an argument and you're positive the conclusion is false, then you got to figure out, is the argument invalid or are one of the premises false? because if the conclusion's false, then you know it can't be sound. So if the premises are true and the conclusion follows logically from the premises, that means the conclusion can't be false. The conclusion must be true. So if you've got a sound argument, then you should accept the conclusion. A sound argument guarantees a true conclusion. Now, figuring out which arguments are sound is its own issue. That's tricky. And that's what we're going to spend a lot of this course looking at different arguments, trying to figure out, is this argument sound? Is this argument sound? And trying to find out the truth by looking at different arguments. But once you've got a sound argument and you know it's sound, then you have to accept the conclusion because the premises are true and the conclusion follows from those premises. So you can't think an argument is sound and not accept the conclusion. If you believe the argument is sound, then you ought to believe the conclusion. So here's an example of a sound argument. George Washington was a U.S. president. That's premise 1. All U.S. presidents are politicians. That's premise 2. Therefore, George Washington was a politician. That's the conclusion. And that's a sound argument. George Washington was, in fact, a U.S. president. That's a historical fact. All U.S. presidents are politicians. By definition, president is a political job. If you have that political job, then you are in politics and you are a politician. Therefore, George Washington was a politician. Not for his whole life, not when he was a baby, but for part of his life, he was a politician. Premises are true. The argument is valid, and therefore the argument is sound. We can know that the conclusion is true because we've got true premises and a sound argument, true premises and a valid argument. So therefore we have a sound argument, and that means the conclusion must be true. Another sound argument is the one we looked at a minute ago. Lassie is a dog. That's true. All dogs are animals. That's true. Therefore, Lassie is an animal. That's true. The conclusion follows from the premises, so the argument's valid, and all of the premises are true, so therefore the conclusion must be true. So that's a sound argument. And so in philosophy, our goal is always to find sound arguments for conclusions, because once you've got a sound argument, you know the conclusion is true. So we want sound arguments because you know that it's okay to believe the conclusion. You know that you're justified in believing the conclusion when you've got a sound argument. The conclusion must be true. And so we always want sound arguments. So we're going to look at arguments this semester and we're going to ask, are they sound? Are the premises of this argument true? Is the argument valid? Does this conclusion really follow from these premises? And so on. And that's going to be how we try to find answers to different questions and figure out which answers are right. However, we have one more condition that we want out of a good argument, and we will talk about that in the next video.